In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, Christ is in our midst. Perfect. Beautiful. I wanted to take a moment to speak a little bit about the gospel reading today, where we hear about Zacchaeus, who was a chief tax collector, and it says, and he was rich. Now, for those of you who have read the Gospels or have heard the stories in the Gospels, that the tax collectors were a crooked group of people. They were people who put the squeeze, if you will, on those who couldn't pay their taxes. They were also many times unjust, unfair, thieves themselves, and had such a connection with the government that they could pretty much do whatever they wanted. And if there was any issues of someone not paying, they would just simply put them in jail until they could pay. Now, for those who do the math on that, if you're in jail and you have to pay something that you didn't have when you were working, you'll never be able to pay it back when you're in jail. So the tax collectors were a hated group of people. Now just imagine, think of Christ coming down this road, and all the people are there, sick people, lame people on the side, the blind, the people who are hurt and suffering, and they line the roads for Jesus. People who knew who he was, were reaching out to him, wanted healing, wanted the grace of God. And then there's this little short tax collector who climbs up into a tree. Now, you can imagine the colorful language that was probably being thrown around on the streets of Jerusalem when this little man was up in the tree, and they're probably looking at him like, "What are you doing? You're awful. Christ is not here for you. He doesn't want you. He's here to help us. What are you doing up in the tree?" But he was just up in the tree waiting to see Christ. And then Christ walks, and the beautiful thing about Christ so many times is he's walking down a street or he's somewhere, and he dials into something that everyone else missed. Whether it's the man screaming, help me," in the back, and he stops and said, "Bring him here." Or when he's walking in a crowd and everybody's pushing up against him and he says, "Somebody touched me." And St. Peter says, "Of course somebody touched you. Everybody's touching us. We're in a crowded area." And he says, "No, I felt power go from me." And then in today's gospel reading, he sees this man, this wretched tax collector who everyone hated, in a tree, just to see him as he passed by. And he stops and he looks at him and he says, "Zacchaeus," by name. Not like he was like, "Hey, I'm Zacchaeus." He didn't do that. But he turns and he says, "Zacchaeus, get out of the tree quickly because I'm coming to your house." And then what does everybody on the street do? They're like, "Really? He's going to the house of a tax collector? That guy? Because he was in a tree?" So he goes to the tax collector's house, to Zacchaeus' house. And Zacchaeus says right off the bat, as soon as he walks in, "Half of my goods I give to the poor. The other half, everyone I cheated out of something, I'm going to restore it fourfold." And Christ says, "Today salvation has come to your house." Not because of what he merely said, but because of Christ actually walking into his home. It's the precursor for house blessings, to bring Christ into our home, to bring salvation into our home. So we see that Zacchaeus says something that's completely different than a gospel reading we heard a few weeks ago, when we heard about this man saying, "I need to tear down my barns, and I need to build bigger barns so that I can store all my grains so that I can have food to eat for many years." And then we hear the opposite of a man who was rich and said, I can do with less. Salvation will come to me with less instead of more. But the key to the gospel reading today is we hear two different sides. We hear a side of a man who was broken, who finds Christ, and then we hear of people who thought they found Christ, but yet look at the broken with judgment. So we see these two opposite ends. We see people who were seeking Christ, but missing what salvation is, and then someone who was missing and ultimately finds salvation. So what does this say to us? Why is this gospel reading? We hear this prior to Lent all the time, every single year. A couple weeks before the beginning of Lent, we hear this gospel. Why? Because it's a reminder to us, all of us, that we have to do two things. We have to accept Christ in our hearts first, and then welcome him into our homes, into our lives, into our everyday routine. That no matter how bad we were, it doesn't matter. It matters that we are seeking salvation, and we are seeking the forgiveness that Christ offers. We are seeking the presence of God in our lives. And no matter where we were, does it really matter? And that's a question we all have to process and understand, because if we think where we were is going to prevent us from where we can be, then we completely lose the life of St. Paul. Because St. Paul was persecuting Christians, becomes one of the greatest saints in the church. There's more words of Christ more words of St. Paul in the Bible than those of Christ himself. So we see that the brokenness of our lives can be put away, and we can accept Christ in our hearts and make the change to get rid of the things that were wrong in our lives. So Zacchaeus said, half of the things that I did in my life, whether they were just or unjust, I'm giving them away. And if I really stole from somebody, I'm going to go back to them and give it to them 4 times over. Because he realizes that he cannot have the ultimate good and the ultimate sin in the same household. He has to get rid of one to accept the other. He has to get rid of the thievery and the understanding of cheating people out of his life before he can truly accept Christ into his life. The other part of that is, how do we see other people? I know from hearing people in church throughout my time as a priest, not here, but this is my 4th church I've served. So I've heard it in different churches. And I've only been here for a couple months, so some of these stories, if you think they apply to you, they probably don't, but maybe they do. My point is this. At Easter time, during Holy Week, when we see the services and people start coming, and they sit in your pew, they sit in your seat, that you have worn your particular body print into that seat the other 51 Sundays a year, and you have your little neighborhood, and then you see somebody who sits down, and they're all dressed to the nines, and they come for Good Friday, Holy Thursday, Holy Wednesday, whatever it is, Anastasis, and they sit down, and you walk in, and you're in the back, you just lit your candle, God bless us all, and you look up, and you're like, seriously, somebody just sat in my pew? This could not be. They need to move. Don't they know that that's my seat? How dare they? You know that person that's there, they never come to church, and they just stole my pew. And if it's not bad enough, they laid out their entire repository of coats across the pews to save it for all the family members that are going to come at 11:59 to sit down and then grab their candle and they're going to leave. These are things that I hear from people in the congregation. But I say to you today that you have to not become like the people who lined the streets when Zacchaeus was in the tree. Not to become the people that say, look at that clown up there. Or look at that person that's in my pew. Or look at that person who's sitting in the front row. They never come. Look at these people. And we become the judges. And when we judge, we push out the ability to accept Christ into our lives. So that's why this is presented to us today, prior to Lent, to give us the understanding that we can change and that we should not judge other people. Because if we don't make the changes, we can't accept Christ. And if we've made the changes and we judge others, we push Christ out of our lives. So it's very important to think a little bit differently. And as you come for the Easter services and you see somebody in your pew, don't get upset. Just say, thank God that they're here for this one day, if that's all it is. And maybe something that is said in the service, maybe something that you say will bring them back again and again and again. Because most of the time, it's not what we say that keeps people coming back, but it's what we say to people that keeps them out, that pushes them away. And society and people throughout the world are looking for an excuse to push God out of their lives. They're looking for the priest to say something wrong so they can say, well, I went and he said this and I'm out. Or I was at church and I went to coffee hour, nobody said anything to me. So how is this a community of Christ? How is this welcoming? Or I was in a pew and I decided that I was going to change my life and come back to church, and somebody said, hey, Jack, get out of my pew because I sit there. So I left. These are actual stories that people say. And this is why we have to change our mindset and allow the suffering to re-enter. Because St. John Chrysostom says, the church is not a country club. It's not a fitness center. It's not a place to have free breakfast. He doesn't use all those terms, but he does say this. He says, it is a hospital for the sick, for the suffering, for the needy, for the dying. And we all in the pews and in the front of the church are the nurses, the male nurses, the female nurses, the male doctors, the female doctors, those who enter and embrace and welcome in. We are all servants and helpers for one another. So we have to have this right disposition of accepting Christ into our lives and also welcoming those back. Because if we push people away, you'll have your pew. You'll have it, and it'll just be you in the pew. So we have to embrace and open our hearts and open our lives to receive God, to receive others, and to let Christ deal with those who are changing in the way that Christ deals with it. And that is done pastorally in the church. It's done through the sacraments of the church. But our job here is to make sure that we line the streets embracing Christ as we do, as you line the streets for the great entrance. And as people come forward and those who are not here, that they are brought forward and presented to the church for this healing, for the salvation of their souls and for the salvation of our souls. Amen.